Welcome. Welcome to the January installment of the Entrepreneurship Lab lecture series, hosted jointly by UNYP, CVUT, and Innovacentrum. We have Howard Rokofsky today with the cultural intelligence, and so thank you for joining us, Howard.
Thanks. As Aaron said, I'm Howard Rokofsky, and it's my pleasure and privilege to be here today to give you this short seminar on cultural intelligence. It should take about an hour, and we will have probably enough time afterwards for some Q&A and some discussion. Now my presentation is extremely content-based, perhaps the most content-based presentation I've ever given. So I ask, don't bother taking notes because you'll miss something. It's going to be information after information. If you have a question, feel free to go like that, and I'll call and we can have an impromptu, quick discussion in the middle if necessary. Otherwise, just wait for the end, and we'll hopefully have time for everybody. Now, if I were to ask everybody in this room what they feel, what comes to mind when reading these statements, everybody here would undoubtedly have a different opinion and a different interpretation and a different attitude, different direction of thought to these statements. Now, the attitude and opinions that you have will be in no small part a result of where you grew up. For example, if you grew up in a culture which was very collectivist, in other words, team effort, social harmony in a group, as a society, you would have one attitude to this. If you grew up in a country which was mostly individualist, you would have quite a different answer, quite a different attitude to these statements. Now, I don't have to tell you how many components make up a culture. These are the variables which are more or less culturally unique, and they are ingrained to the people in that culture, and they can be quite confusing to a traveler in another country or to a colleague. Now, during this presentation, you will undoubtedly be having certain thoughts, memories, maybe even a revelation about yourself, your family, and the place you grew up in, and the place you live in now. So if you do have one of those eureka moments, that'll be great. If you'd like to share it with us at the end, that would be fantastic. Now, I want to introduce cultural intelligence as, somebody's at this door, as the capability to function effectively across cultures and across cultural context, with an awareness as well as a strategy of how to cope in those cultures. It's more than just knowing what kind of handshake to do. It's more than knowing if you should bow and how deep you should bow. It's more than knowing if you should kiss 1 time, 2 times, or like in Holland, 3 times on the cheek. It's a lot more than that. The differences are can be very subtle. Some of them will be more obvious. And what I'm going to explain to you today is the differences as well as the strategies of how to deal with it. The capability of dealing across cultures is to move the communication forward without insulting anybody. Now, for example, in China, the shopkeeper in a local shop will follow you around, pointing things out, demonstrating things, chatting the whole time, basically bothering you. And you can just say, I'm just looking. and they will leave you alone for about 30 seconds. And then they'll be right back on you, pointing, demonstrating, recommending, chatting. And you may think that they're just trying to sell you something, but in fact, they are trying to help you. And in their mind, you, of all people, need help. Now, cultural intelligence is more than just being able... cultural intelligence is, among other things, the ability to find your hotel from the airport late at night, in a strange country, negotiating a contract, discussing in a book group. These are skills, people skills, which cultural intelligence will bring you. Cultural intelligence is also related to emotional intelligence. Now, if you already have emotional intelligence, that will be a great head start on cultural intelligence. But even if you don't, even if you're not very skilled in emotional intelligence, you can still be good at cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence picks up where emotional intelligence leaves off. It is about practical people skills. Some things in a culture are more easy to see, like the cooking, the music, the dance, the theater, the games, the literature. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What's harder to see is the concept of justice, raising children, friendship, problem solving. Cultural intelligence qualifies and quantifies this layout of awareness and understanding. Now, just because you or somebody travels all over the world does not mean that they have cultural intelligence. It all depends on how you travel, the people you travel with, the places you go. I have a cousin who's older, and he went to China, and he was so proud of himself for going to China. And he explained to me about this luxury van that he was taxied around in with the tour guide, the driver, and 5 clueless tourists who were being escorted to places the tour guide wanted them to see. Now, you can be sure that these were not places the government wanted them to see. These were places, they were not places the government didn't want them to see. These were quite specifically places where the government did want them to see. And that, if you travel like that, you will not get you won't get the full experience, but you'll also be missing the nuances of the cultural awareness from those places. Now, as a bonus, if you improve your cultural intelligence, your emotional intelligence will automatically improve as a result. I wonder if that's clear for everybody. Okay, well, emotional intelligence is the ability to feel and read your own emotions as well as other people's emotions. Social intelligence is the ability to gauge what other people's moods and attitudes. And you can learn that by itself, or if you learn cultural intelligence, your emotional intelligence will automatically improve. Now, there has been a lot of discussion on leadership across cultures, what makes a good international leader, or how to satisfy international employees. These are subjects of entire presentations on their own, and for the purpose of this presentation, I will focus on the general cultural differences and concepts of the cultures. It helps to be curious. It helps to be adventurous, to try out new experiences, to try out new foods. It helps to be flexible, to rephrase your words if the other person doesn't understand. You have to know when to follow and when to lead, and when to insist and when to give in. These are very subtle skills which, if you're in a far-off country with a completely different culture, you will be confused at the beginning. But hopefully I will clear some things up and give you a strategy. Sometimes the idiosyncrasies of a culture are quite unpredictable. I remember one time I bet my friend in China, Li Peng, about some information. We bet him a beer. He turned out to be correct. We went to the bar, and I went to order the beer, and he signaled for 2 beers. And I thought, okay, he's just being efficient. His Chinese is better than mine. But then he wouldn't let me pay. And I said, but you won the bet. He said, yeah, that's why I'm paying. So in China, you bet for the privilege to buy somebody else a beer because that makes you cooler. Now, if I had no idea that was coming, that kind of shook me up a bit, and I'll never forget that. There was a study done among 30,000 international managers, other professionals, diplomats, politicians, doctors, and the results are my presentation today. Now, Dr. David Livermore of the Cultural Intelligence Center came up with 10 dichotomies, 10 attitudes, values, differences, which I will be outlining today. Can we generalize about a culture? Can we say that these people are like that, and those people are not like that? Well, the study says we can, to some extent. There will be exceptions, there will be outliers, without a doubt, but the results of the study proved that, or demonstrated, that the cultures are in fact quite different, and the 10 dichotomies that I'll be discussing today were synthesized from other dichotomies that were developed over the years by Gert Hofstede, by Shalom Schwartz, by Edward Hall, among others. I have chosen these 10 to deal with because I find them quite articulate and I find them quite clear. Some of them will overlap together more than others. We'll see that. For example, you'll see that the concept of time will relate to the concept of individuality. And I will explain that as we go on. The concept of power distance will relate to the concept of communication between people, and so on. Now, the first dichotomy I will discuss is identity. Are you an individualist or a collectivist? Who are you? What is your highest value? Is it on the individualist of yourself and your achievements? Or is it on the group as a whole? Your in-group of family, of your work team, of the country as a whole. Now, this develops early in life and shapes our entire lives. The individualist has an internal locus of control. That means that the individualist makes the decisions based on internal attitudes and moods, whereas the collectivist has an external locus of control. That person is controlled by his or her thoughts of the group and society as a whole. Now, the US is the most individual culture in the world. In the US, they bronze the baby shoes. Your baby shoes get bronzed and mounted on the fireplace in the US because in the US it's a very individual culture. The child's first important milestone is walking, a very individual skill. You won't see that in collectivist cultures. Now, in some collectivist countries, the poorer ones, even the children have to work to help support the family. That's a very collectivist ideal. The dichotomy of individualist to collectivist has influence on politics, business, eating habits, personal finances, choosing a school, accepting a job, your religion. Any choice you make is going to be determined by the aspect of identity. Now, you might guess that socialism would go together with collectivism. and to some extent that is valid, but not across the board. For example, Scandinavia is a very individualist culture, but quite socialist. And on the other hand, Singapore and China are very capitalist countries, yet they are collectivist. So we cannot make a rule across the board. For an individualist, you have to be true to yourself. You have to pursue your dreams. Protect yourself from, protect your own freedom. Decide everything that all the decisions that you make will be for the benefit of yourself first. In the collectivist, decisions are made more slowly after discussions with loved ones. You'll find in business, in collectivist countries, the business person will make his own decision, but it may be slow in coming. Those decisions come more slowly. Now, they did a study, and they gave a bunch of, excuse me. Oh yeah. They gave a bunch of anagram puzzles to a group of students. And they told the students that either they can choose their own puzzles, or that their mother chose the puzzles for them to do. And in individualist countries like the Anglo and American countries, 66% more the children had 66% higher scores. They completed more puzzles when they were able to choose their own puzzle. Some of them were appalled to hear that their mother chose the puzzles. In the collectivist countries, the children that had their mother choose the puzzles answered more of them. They were relieved that somebody with authority like their mother could choose the puzzles for them. One American girl was quite appalled by this and said, "You let my mother choose this?" Which in America would be pretty much unheard of. If you grew up in a collectivist culture, your family would concern themselves with your romance and marriage. They would choose a partner for you, perhaps based on the loyalty to the family, the good of the family. You would be choosing your social networks more carefully, and your social networks would have a larger influence on your development than in an individualist culture. Individualist people transition in and out of groups. The loyalty to a particular group has a shorter lifespan in an individualist culture than in a collectivist. Now, globalization and technology have been shifting some of this paradigm, where some collectivist cultures like Latin America, young couples are buying their own home, moving into their own home instead of living with their parents like they used to. And conversely, some individualist cultures, like the United States, students are being taught to work in groups. So today's American students might be more collectivist than their parents were. Now, these shifts, for example, in collectivist cultures, the parents will let their children choose their own husband or wife, or at least give them veto power. And these changes are happening slowly, and they are statistically significant. But that does not mean that these changes are ingrained in the people. These cultures have been long in the making, and these attitudes are very deeply rooted. For example, in India, the McDonald's Employee of the Month award was a complete failure because nobody wanted to win. India is very collectivist. Nobody wanted to win the Employee of the Month contest. So they made it a Team of the Month contest, and they did much better. If Abraham Maslow was Asian, you would probably see at the top of his pyramid social harmony as opposed to self-actualization. Now, if you find yourself in a multicultural team, and if you're a collectivist person and the individual colleague seems to be making decisions on themselves, working more autonomously, don't be insulted. That's just the way they are. If your collectivist colleague keeps asking you for opinion, that doesn't mean that they're not sure of themselves. It just means that they are interested in what's good for the whole group. And that brings me to the second dichotomy, which is power distance. Power distance is the extent to which less powerful members of the group have respect for the authority and how they accept the fact that they are of a lower status. So in some countries with a high power distance, people accept that they have to respect authority. If you're in a low power distance country, then the respect for authority is much smaller, and the differences in power structure will be smaller. Now, you can gauge this by some places where they call their boss by their first name, attitudes of patients to doctors, students to teachers. In high power distance countries, the student always looks up to the teacher, and in low power distance countries, the student may even call the teacher by their first name. It reminds me of a story when I was in India and I was giving a training there. My printing materials were not ready, and it was just a half an hour before we were supposed to start, and I asked, where are my materials? And they said, oh, they're coming. So I said, well, let me go take care of it. Let me go do the copying, which is what I would do here. And they said, no, 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 it's being taken care of. And I got worried about that. Where are my materials? Well, he said, sit down. He poured me some chai. We had a talk. 5 minutes before we were supposed to start, my materials showed up, and they were being distributed. In countries like India with a high power distance, they believe that it is some people's job to print materials, and it is other people's job to teach them. If I had gone and printed my own materials, like I wanted to do, some people would have lost face. Probably myself as well, without even knowing it. In some cultures, kids get to choose what they have for breakfast, and in other cultures, they get what they get. France, compared to its other neighbors, has a quite high power distance. Sweden has an extremely low power distance. It's illegal to hit a child in Sweden, for example. Now, Germany is interesting because Germany has a low power distance, but nevertheless, they respect authority, they function well, and that is quite a unique combination in the world, to have a high power distance, but yet, to have a low power distance, but yet to have such respect for authority. And that's maybe one of the reasons why they're so successful. Now, you'll find high power distance in a lot of collectivist cultures. Now, that might sound counterintuitive. Why would a collectivist culture have a high power distance? I can't answer that. That's just the way it is. In many high power distance countries, even where you sit at the table is important. The most important person sits over here. The second most important person sits to their left. The person who's paying for the meal sits facing the door. and everybody has their place to sit around the table. When I was in China, the biggest mistake I could make at a dinner was to sit myself down, because I would always sit myself next to my friend. But no, I have to sit over here. I'm the guest of honor, I'm the foreigner. I have to sit to the left of the most important person, facing the guy who's facing the door, who's going to pay. It was all very structured. In lower power distance countries, where you sit at the table is not important. You are seated at the table to facilitate communication. Friends sit next to friends. You don't know who's important by looking at a low power distance dinner table. High power distance students will not speak up in class, especially about some controversial or ambiguous topic. You'll find in low power distance countries, like the US, the students will speak up a lot. They don't even have to know the right answer. They'll just throw the idea out there and feel comfortable with that. You won't hear a teacher say, "I don't know," in India, for example, in a high power distance country, because teachers are supposed to know everything. They will not admit that they don't know something. Now, what about in a, yeah?
Yeah, I would like to ask you, where you think that Czech Republic would be on the scale of low to high power distance?
I was going to get to that.
Sorry.
That's okay. I might as well answer. So, the Czech Republic, although was not part of the study, in my semi-learned opinion, I would say that the Czech Republic has a quite low power distance index, even though they use titles. They use a lot of titles, and meetings appear very formal. If you go to a banquet, everybody's wearing a suit and tie, and they're quite formal. Everybody is, if you introduce yourself, they'll say their last name, which is quite formal. But I think that this is a result of previous regimes where these aspects were forced upon them. In my opinion, the Czech society is quite a low power distance. People do not have a very high respect or regard for authority, even though to the outsider it might seem that they do. Now, when high power distance students come to a low power distance country to study, they are very disoriented, because in class they are encouraged to speak out, but at home they're supposed to keep their mouths closed. They could be very confused by the difference in attitudes in the classroom and at home. And this has been no small point of